We are especially pleased to have Sarah Beth Wilson lead the discussion for this panel, for which she is so uniquely qualified. As a woman in arts administration, she's keenly aware of the challenge of change. The top administrative positions in the most esteemed institutions are still held by men. Betty Moody describes Sarah Beth as Houston's newest rising star in the art community. She has made a wonderful collaborator, and I honestly could not have done this without her. Thank you so much, all of you, and I want to welcome Sarah Beth Wilson.
Okay, well, thank you all, and hopefully this mic will, can everyone hear me okay? Okay, so we're gonna give this a shot here. Thank you, Lisa, for that, I don't know where you went, but, oh, back there, for that wonderful introduction. And it's so great to see all of you. Some faces I recognize, some I do not, but I hope I get to meet you, if not this evening at some point around. It's a small art community. So I'm sure we'll be crossing paths. Also, thank you, just real quick, to the VAA. I'm very impressed just with what I've learned about the VAA and their commitment to the arts scene here in Houston. I mean, that kind of, especially volunteer run and that kind of organization and programming really from a grassroots level is all like basically what makes everything happen here. So without organizations like that, the Houston art community would not be where it is today. So thank you very much, and it's our pleasure to be here and join all of you today. So just a real quick, because Lisa asked me to intro before I turn it over to the artists here. My name is Sarah Beth Wilson, and I am Director of Exhibitions and Curatorial Projects at Art League Houston. And Art League is going on its 71st year. I am going on my 3rd month with them, so I've got a while to catch up there. But before that, I was with the Art Museum of Southeast Texas for 4.5 years, and then prior to that, I worked for a couple of different art galleries here in Houston and taught. Rabea and I were talking, I actually taught with Lone Star College North Harris, and we probably crossed paths like multiple times. We just had no idea who each other were. I was also extremely young and had no idea what I was doing. So.
I was probably coming at night, teaching night class.
Yeah, exactly. So that's been one great thing about this panel is I have known about each of these artists and studied their work in various capacities, but had never met them until. So thank you to Lisa and the VAA for bringing us together. That's been a really great opportunity to get the time to talk with each of you. So the way we're gonna do this is I've asked each of the artists to give a quick 2 to 3 minute intro. We've got blueberries up here. We're gonna toss them at each other if we go over too long. Just kidding, not really. But they're gonna give a quick intro into who they are, and I'm sure you'll think that wasn't enough, but we'll have more of that come out in the panel discussion to follow, and then there will also be time for some Q&A at the end. So if you'll save any questions you've got to the end, we'll be sure to get to those. And just a couple of things before we get going to, I was thinking a lot. I was actually thinking this morning and reading, I think it was something on NPR about, I want to say it's a recent study shows that hopefully by like 2056, we may have equal pay between men and women, and that just really struck me. That's fascinating. Don't quote me on that number, but it was something outrageous like that. And Lisa was great and had emailed us some somewhat recent articles from the past couple of years from nationwide, but also local arts writers, and I was kind of reminiscing about my first time. So I went to Baylor for undergrad and then TCU for graduate school. And I can remember my theory and crit class reading Linda Naucklin's seminal essay, Why Are There No Great Women Artists? And has anyone read that in here? It's from 1971. So that was written in 1971, and it still rings true, so much of it. And as I was reading these recent articles, I was really thinking about that and how much, although a lot has changed and we've come a long way, there's still so much that needs to be done, both for gender, race, all sorts of equitable and ethical decisions. And with my new position at Art League, that's something I'm really proud to be doing, and hopefully, at least with my curatorial practice, making sure that I'm constantly aware of those things and working for organizations that support that. So, but if you have not read Linda Naucklin's essay, I encourage you to do so. That's just a really great article and something I think anyone interested in gender equality should read and review. The basic gist of it is there are not any great women artists because they were never given the same basically opportunities as men, whether it was from education or institutions that support them. So that's something I hope we can all talk about today, and also look at the positive things going forward that we can all be a part of. So that's something that I think all of y'all have great things to say about. Okay, and if y'all see me looking at my phone, I'm just watching time. Promise I'm not Facebooking, so just to kind of keep us on track. Okay, well, Pat, I think we're going to start with you.
Yes.
And go ahead.
All right. Hello, I'm Pat Colville, and I'm so happy to be here this evening with you. I was born in New Orleans, and my parents were transferred out of New Orleans, but I stayed in a boarding school there until I graduated from high school. And then my family moved here to Houston, and I decided it was time to come home, and I came here and went to the University of Houston, where I got a Bachelor of Science degree in abnormal psychology, and which has stood me in great stead. But my minor was art, and I had almost the equivalent of a double major. Also, I loved writing and reading and studying. I took all the English classes, literature classes that I possibly could. When I graduated from the University of Houston, I immediately got married and went to live in Spain, in a town south of Barcelona, where we stayed for a year. And I used to go into Barcelona, and my husband was doing handprint setting, doing Thomas Wolfe's excerpts from Thomas Wolfe, and I was working in a little room above in what was Juan Moreau's studio. I didn't really appreciate it at the time, but since have. I saw all his tools around and everything, and did a few lithographs. Then I came back, and we lived in Houston, and finally moved to, I came back and lived to Dallas, and then finally moved to Houston. In the meantime, I had 2 children, and my first experience was going to it was the art museum school. It wasn't the Glassell at the time. It was in the basement of the museum. So I would ride my bike there, I remember. So I was in school there, and then after, when I was still a child before I got married. And then when I came back to Houston, I enrolled again. And subsequently, I taught there afterwards, and then now I've been a student at Glassell. So my life has sort of evolved around the Glassell, around the Houston Museum. In '69, we started the art department at the University of St. Thomas. The Menils had left St. Thomas and more or less left a vacuum there for the studio art students. So I, along with a number of colleagues, 2 colleagues, came in, fulfilled the obligation there to the art students. And I stayed there for a while until I found out that I wasn't paid the same as the men, but it was due because I didn't have a master's. So then I decided to go to Sam Houston and try to take a master's. I could take 1 class a semester, and I figured that it would take me 10 years to do that, to get my master's, in order to get the equivalent pay. So I wrote letters to everybody asking them if they would take a graduate student at large. And one time I was explaining the situation to a friend, and the head of the art department at the University of Oklahoma said, "I'll do it for you." In the meantime, I had written asking for, in order to supplement what this project was going to be for me, I written to the NEA and Atelier in London to take me on to do an edition of Prince, and everything came through at the same time. I got the NEA, I got the acceptance to work in London, and I packed my bags. When I came back, I stayed a year there, and I came back, and I stayed here the summer before I was to start school again at St. Thomas. And I decided my bags are still packed. I didn't want to step back, even though I had my master's at this time. I decided to take the leap and move to New York. And I got an oriental rug, 2 bedside tables, and moved to New York. And there I stayed for 40 years, coming back for my family and visiting, and being at Watson Denage and having Clint as my backbone here in Houston. So, but it's been quite a journey. And between my times in London, while I was in London, I moved to the south of France, and I lived on the coast, and I also lived in Arles, where I lived in the same square where Vincent van Gogh did, and everything was exactly, I mean, the men wore the same blue suits. I went to Arles, I went to Aix-en-Provence, and everything was the same as Cézanne. So it was a real awakening for me to realize that people paint what they see. And I felt that while I was there, I was lacking the culture. My roots are here in the South, and even though we spoke the same language in London, it was a different culture. It was far from understanding my way of life. And so here I am. I've been back for 9 years now, living sort of in the country. And this has been, and I returned, and because I really didn't have my roots again, I went back to the Glasshouse School and have met wonderful people and reacquainted myself with this city and eaten a lot of Mexican food. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Terrell James. Good to be here with you. Thank you all for coming. And it's really been quite a treat getting to talk with my fellow artists here. We've had a few meetings just with us, and Sarah Beth was with us, one of those. It's just been a real thought-provoking experience because we're trying to review how we're here and what we've done to get here. So it's been pretty interesting for me, I know. I've spent most of my adulthood here in Houston. Many of you are people I know and have worked with for different ways, different experiences, some through teaching. A little bit like Pat, I feel like my life has been very much, the axis, the backbone has been the Museum of Fine Arts and the school. So ever since I was a little child, I wanted to be drawing and making a mark. I can remember just the first times I was able to draw at all, that seemed like the most powerful thing I could ever do, to change a surface with one line. I was drawing all the time. Most of the people in my family were more oriented toward books, and some were writers. I was the one person not reading all the time, but drawing all the time. I was lucky enough to have a family that thought that was just fine, and I was also able to study, even as a 4-year-old, starting with the beginning, like Pat, even as a very young person with the museum school classes at one point in the same basement. We probably walked right by each other, which is kind of a familiar experience in Houston anyway. There's this kind of lovely intersection of all of us, I think. But so I wanted to be an artist as a child. I can remember every artist I was introduced to as a very young person all the way, say, through my 20s. It just seemed like there was something very real about the conversations I had with these people. And it almost struck me, even as a pretty young kid, that this was almost like a calling. The communication with the artists I met, even when I was, only 10 or 15, seemed a little bit more real or grounded than most of the people I was meeting. So that was a sense of wonder that stuck with me. So I went through, I was taking lots of classes. I even got to start painting with oil as a 10-year-old. in college years, I decided I wanted to go to a liberal arts college rather than a place specifically to study art, because I wanted to read. A little bit like Pat, I wanted to study literature and philosophy and all sorts of things. I felt like there'd be time for a more rigorous training with more elaborate equipment later in life. So I went to Sewanee, which is a small liberal arts school in Tennessee, and it had a fairly potent, small, intimate department, and I really did enjoy being there and working outdoors quite a bit. So I think part of my development as being so involved with light and nature comes from the time there working outdoors through different seasons, different environmental conditions. Anyway, after that, I ended up coming back to Houston, and I wasn't planning to stay here, but what happened was I needed to be here. My father died very young, and there were reasons I needed to be here for that, both emotional, but I was also the executrix of the estate, so all of a sudden I was here for a while, and I felt a little bit stunned, and one of my good friends from earlier, with whom I had taken classes in high school at the at the museum school, said, you know, you need to start getting back to some structure with your work. Why don't you sign up for printmaking? And that was a wild thing too, because all of a sudden Houston was so much more interesting than I had known. It was full of people from all over the world. It was much more international, this class I took at the iteration of the school that was temporarily on Garrett Street, weirdly across the street from my first childhood home that I can remember, which was my great-grandparents' house. So Houston was a lot more than I knew from my little Lamar High School, right? So it seemed like a place that I could actually stay and be enjoying. So the next thing that happened was I started, you know, being a curious person, going to gallery shows and learning about who was here and what we had to look at. We went to openings. I met people at the printmaking class. I met a lot of these interesting artists from all over the world, and ended up being invited to start a small nonprofit gallery downtown. It was what is now the Cloister. We didn't have that name yet. It was at Christ Church. So that was in '78. I ran that for about 3 years. Somehow, the great thing that happened was I was invited to apply for a job, which I got at the Archives of American Art at the Texas Project, and that was the most fabulous job for a young artist. I was 25 to age 30 when I got to do that. So here I was, allowed to read other people's mail, even supposed to. A lot of artist journals. Anyway, I learned a lot about how people progress throughout their lives as artists, and also collectors and gallerists, some museum curators, all sorts of really good information that was fascinating to me. I think that was a big effect for me. At that same time in the 80s, I was invited to start showing my work with Bill Graham, who had a lovely gallery. I worked with him for 4 or 5 years, and after the job at the archives closed, I accepted working 3 days a week for a different gallery, which is Hiram Butler Gallery, where I now show my work. I think we worked for 3 or 4 years together that way, part-time, and then I switched and started showing with him and working somewhere else. But the point is, you know, you get these strange opportunities and jobs that come along the way. But I think it's important, you know, as an artist, especially starting out, to realize that you probably do need to have a steady income and a day job of some sort. And I don't know, that was my experience, certainly. At one point, I was invited to start teaching at Glassell. I did not planned to be someone who taught, but it turns out it's been a very important part of my practice because I learn as much as the people who are in my classes. I think it's a way to get back in touch with the part of art that's why you wanted to be an artist to begin with, rather than the part that's more commercial. And it's very helpful to remember those basic questions that you have as someone studying art. I still love that about it. That's pretty much what I need to say. I guess I've been interested in learning more through using all kinds of different materials. Most people know me as a painter, but I do a lot of other things, including, printmaking and bronze sculpture and working in clay and things that many of you may not have seen of mine. But I think also working with different materials certainly keeps you fresh, and it keeps you on the track of wanting to learn more. And one thing, when I work with one material, it always opens up a discovery that crawls into the other ones. So that's pretty much what I have to say for the introduction.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rabea, and there are a few familiar faces that I see, and thank you so much. But there's the majority are faces that I'm not familiar with, so this is fun for me. It's been amazing being in conversation with these two amazing artists, and it was sort of an eye-opening experience for me that I'll share with you later. But just to kind of introduce myself, I was told recently that where you went to elementary school is where you're from. So I'm from DeRidder, Louisiana, which is about 3 hours, 4 if we're headed to New Orleans, which we often did. My father is a Texan, very proud Texan from Amarillo. He met my mother when he was stationed in Germany. She's German. So I'm also from there, which is a very unique background. I've been living in Houston for 16 years already. And it was a lot safer to say I came here in 2003, but I wanted to be honest, and it really felt like a time to sit and really reflect on how long I've been here in Houston. So we're going to be talking about that. But I came to Houston to study at the University of Houston. I was thinking about the #1 reason why, and it was really because Michael Ray Charles went to the University of Houston, and I was desperate to follow in his footsteps. I was very much influenced by him. We also went to the same undergrad, although I didn't know it at the time. My 3rd year at the University of Houston, I was studying painting and drawing. I discovered J.D. Ojai-Kare, who's a Nigerian photographer who photographs hair. And it was the first time that I ever thought about hair as sculpture, in which his work is about. And it really changed my art making process and my content. And it made me really think about hair as a way of investigating identity. And I had a lot of years to fall back on because I worked in my mom's hair salon through junior high school, through college, basically as an uncertified beautician. And I started braiding hair, and I was braiding hair for money through college, through graduate school, through a lot of my first years here in Houston just to earn money. In short, my work is really about identity and otherness. I used to call it otherness, and now I refer to it as intersectionality, which I'm now obsessed with learning more about because I'm interested in not just differences in sort of our outward cultural expressions that we can control, like hair, and then those that we can't control, like skin. But there's so much more to our identities. We talked about so many similarities over the course of our conversations when normally we would assume that we have more differences than not. So that, in short, is what I'm investigating and what my work sort of stemmed from, and it now is becoming more abstracted and open to more interesting areas of overlapping. That's kind of where I'm at currently.
Thank you, Rebecca. Eric, I think you may already be changing the slide. You're already on it. Oh, can we start at the beginning? Not that it really matters, it just loops. We're all good. Okay. Well, thank you all for that great introduction. I mean, that was amazing. And I think that kind of gives everyone a little bit of your background and then kind of a jumping off point for us here. So what I want to start with today, and the way, we kind of went about this panel was we all met, stepped away, thought of some questions. I wanted to make sure I, talked about some things that were resonating with the artists here, but then we kind of all stepped back again and organize our thoughts more. And so that's kind of where this is coming from. And I want to start off kind of talking about experiences and challenges in some ways that you each have had. And not every artist has to answer, just if you want to take it, or if you each have something to say, chime in. But to begin with, when we were brainstorming the title of this panel discussion and the description, all of you were very defiant that you did not want women artists in the title, that you just want to be referred to as artists. Can someone talk about that a minute and just kind of elaborate on that?
Okay. They're looking at me. I think I know why, because I was the first one that said, "Do we really want to have women in the title?" And I guess for me, it just felt unnecessary. It's obvious looking at us, but it was also not descriptive enough. And as someone who is very interested in labels, but also very opposed to labels, although I don't ignore them, I just felt like that one is so overused, and it doesn't even conjure up the type of image making that we do. And just so out of the starting block, I just felt like, the gender disparity in the arts part kind of did it for me. It was enough in the title.
Thank you. Yeah, that's something all of y'all kind of picked up on that was, I think, pretty important as we led into things. So going back, and Pat, you've mentioned your time away from Houston and why you left. And Terrell, you've mentioned your work with the Smithsonian, the Texas Art Project. I want y'all to talk a little bit. Both of y'all in our discussions have talked about this kind of boys club atmosphere that you either encountered through research or you knew. Pat, maybe you start us off with talking a little bit about the early days.
In '69, when we started the University of St. Thomas, I was home. I had 2 children. I taught at St. Thomas. I taught at the museum school first. I've taught all my life, really. And I really wasn't part of the social life. But when I got involved in St. Thomas, it became more apparent to me, or else it was just starting to grow. But certainly it's what Pete Gerson talked about in his book, Collusion, about the beginning of the Texas art movement. And it was a great time. They had great fun, but it didn't pertain to me in any way. And it was a turnoff to me. But it was a very productive time for many people. There were groups of men that came together. I always felt like an outsider, and even more because of the interaction between the teachers, the male artists in town. Okay. Mm-hmm. So, and that was one of the things, there were many things why I left Houston. Not only did I not have a master's, but I was recently divorced, and just a sense of not feeling like I belonged. A sense of, there was a very active art world. Lefty Adler was here at the CAM. Harithus came to the CAM. And there were many parties and many openings, and wild things were going on. And it wasn't for me. And I felt I had read Lillian Hellman, at that time, her book, Pentimento. And I thought she wanted to get out of town, and I wanted to get out of town. So I went there cold, no job, no nothing. But that's what was happening at the time, and that's what gave me the impetus to leave.
Well, I would say, first of all, one thing we all talked about together was the fact that you can't separate, the art world from the general situation in our society. It's a subset. It's the same problems that exist in any category of work, I would say. But, for me, I didn't personally feel the boys' club experience too much, except I did in college. And that was interesting because there was one group, kind of the more serious students would go off and paint together till, at the side of a dark lake until 5 in the morning, and it was always just men. And I just asked one time, I said, could I come? And they said, sure. But I think there was a kind of a hesitant quality for other students who were women to do that. I don't know what it is about me that I don't really have much of a fear to ask to be involved in things, which helps. But the other thing is, there was certainly in the 60s and 70s kind of a cowboy bravado here, I think, that I did see a little bit working with the history through the archives of things in the, let's say, late 50s through early 70s. At the same time, there were so many important women artists here, starting in the 20s and 30s. And, I also went to this public school, middle school called Lanier, and there were some beautiful murals there by some of the women who did the ones in the downtown library. So some of those people had the idea of starting the Art League, women, and the Art League kind of started the Museum of Fine Arts, if I'm remembering that correctly. And so there was always a kind of a sense of groundbreaking by women here. But when I was, say, starting to show my work professionally in the 80s, it certainly seemed like a minority of women in the system, and I think it still is.
Yeah, thank you. I think you can definitely see, we actually were doing a little bit of research looking at current organizations. And while we have seen a growth in women leadership roles, they are primarily white, female. So that's the strong point of that. And so there's still a lot of work to do there. And especially once you get to the executive director level, you start to see some of that disparity kind of showing more. Rabea, can you talk a little bit, that same question, kind of looking at the atmosphere, but like the current kind of with right now going on?
Well, it was a little bit difficult because I think I was thinking about Boys Club on just a personal level of like creatives and how we interact with one another. And I think Terrell had sort of enlightened me to like just thinking about it a little bit bigger and broader. And I don't come with a lot of that experience. But what I can speak to is my experience just as an artist in my community and how supportive I have been from my male counterparts. As soon as I got to Houston, I was sort of swept in and always had studios with male artists and been invited to participate in shows, because I kind of had that experience, as you said, about, just not even having to ask, because I'm a little bit opposite. I'm more shy to ask than not, which doesn't help that much in this career. But so my experience was a little bit different in that sense. But I just have felt like just a lot of support in that sense.
Yeah, and I have one more thing to say. I think a lot of us have been talking about and really enjoying reading Mary Gabriel's book, 9th Street Women. And in her introduction, she talks a lot about this show that was put on in 51 in New York on 9th Street. But one of my favorite quotes is from Milton Resnick, and he says, hell, we were all just artists putting something together, and there wasn't any question of gender. We just, a lot of the women were the stronger ones about which wall they wanted, and, So in a way, some of that Rabea is saying, I don't feel the exclusion really from artists, other artists, men artists. I feel a lot of support from a lot of them. It's more like the whole sort of superstructure around it.
So in y'all's opinion, I'm going to go off this isn't one of our questions, but just prompting from that. Why do you think that is? What do you think specifically in Houston? All of y'all have lived in other places and kind of come back here. Do you think it's something specific to this area and the institutions happening here, or did you see that in other places as well?
Well, since I've only been back after having been gone for 40 years, so I feel sort of like a newcomer and can't really speak about the situation now. But I don't see any of that. I mean, I see in the gallery where I am at Betty's, respect held by everybody for towards their work. So I'm not seeing that. But then again, I'm coming from a different place. And but I don't think it was the same. At least it is not the same for me as it was in the 70s, in that particular period, because I think people have gotten more serious. Times are different. All these things have changed.
I think that if we're talking about sort of situations where we might exclude others based on their gender, now what I see more areas that are still separate here in the Houston climate, I'm not sure if you're going to get to that with a later question, but it's always been more of a racial
Yes.
thing where, I try to permeate as many spaces as I can. When I go to white shows, the audience is white. When I go to black shows, the audience is black. There's not a good representation of mixed crowds. I look at audiences really to gauge climates. Of course, you have the artist who's showing, but it's who is showing up that often tells me more about what the climate is like and feels like. And since I've only lived in Houston as a working artist as opposed to living outside of the city as a working artist, that I can only speak to those experiences now. Just the current situation with like the Latin Arts Now movement, which is such a wonderful moment that we're having right now, I was kind of saddened noticing the void that there was. I'm just speaking personally, what I haven't been tapped into. It's my fault. I don't have enough artist friends that identify as Latinx. If I did, I'd be going to their shows. You know what I mean? So a lot of that is, what I choose to support and where I choose to support. And like I said, I try to permeate those spaces, but because of this movement and this moment that the Latin Arts Now is having, I think from pretty much February through May, like currently, I've just seen like so much emerging, and it's just sort of like now, though, it's like 3 separate groups instead of me thinking of them as 2 separate.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how much of that is because you have to have so many part-time jobs and be pulled away from research and thinking a little bit more about practical things,
Yeah.
which is part of most artists' experience. But I remember when we were first starting to talk, Rabea said, well, we can talk about this, I can talk about things from the standpoint of race, but I certainly don't feel up to representing artists of color, women of color. One of the interesting things when we were all looking into the statistics about this, which we weren't going to be rattling off, and anyone can look this up, but there were so many things about inclusion of women or inclusion of people of color. But there was no research of women of color as a particular subset. So that's something that even the National Museum of Women Artists and the Art in Washington, they said, we just discovered this huge void in even calculating what that is.
And I think that's why the title, just women artists, isn't enough.
Right.
It doesn't tell enough.
One thing that's happening, excuse me.
No.
Henry Gonzalez has started this collaboration between this BioArt and the Buffalo Bayou Park, which I think is very interesting, and igniting the interest in the artists in the East End. So, and he's in the audience here tonight.
Oh.
So
Want to meet you?
there are things that are happening, and he certainly has been behind so much of the interest.
You were kind enough to send us a link to that, and it looks
Yes,
really important and
yes.
interesting.
They've had a long period of activity going along the bayou from Shepherd on down.
Where are you?
Henry,
Oh, where are you? Hello. Just wanted to be sure to talk to you.
So following on that point then, talking about just exhibitions and your experience getting exhibitions, whether it's at a gallery, arts organization, museum, institution, whatever that is, do you find that you've been approached? Do you find that it works best when you've had a community of artists that you're colleagues with that are going and pitching shows? I mean, how do you see those things happening now, or what have your experiences been over the years?
One of the reasons I included an image of the Rue Collective that I'm a part of is because that came out of rejection. It came out of asking to show in a space and being rejected. Now that is something as an art maker that it comes with the job, right? We are so used to that, and then it's fine. Your story that led you to an NEA grant and then living out of the, I mean, that came out of rejection, so we get that. But the other thing is we're responsible what to do with that rejection. Let it like hinder you from showing the work anyway, or showing the work anyway. And that's how we formed the Rue Collective. We just created sort of on a very grassroots level spaces that we wanted to enter and make them happen. So I think for me, it just depends on the time, you know, whether or not, you know, being asked to do things versus asking to show in spaces. As a Rue Collective, we typically ask to show in spaces. It's all three, really, but the most important, and when the Whitney curators came down and spoke at U of H, I remember I wanted to ask them, how would someone like me get on your radar? Oh, I did ask them that, and speaking to them directly. How does an emerging artist, how do you discover us? How are you going to discover me? And her answer was, don't even think about that. Like, just start making the work and just start showing it. We're going to find out through other artists. And man, that really changed the way I looked at things. Because like waiting around for that,
Somebody to call you.
that's not the smartest thing to do.
I have also found that artists help each other. Artists
So much.
lead the way for other artists, and it's all part of the importance of being able to be with each other and talk more, kind of like we are now. This is a great opportunity, and I don't think we really do that enough, actually. I don't, but I do feel like my experience of showing in different cities has also been very enriching, and some of that has just come where, you know, someone in a different city with a gallery will invite me, but then when I go, I try to go several times and get to know the artists there, and then, you know, maybe invite them to come here, do different things with communities connecting with each other. And, you know, sometimes you just have to go to a place and explore it and be open. But it does happen. I mean, that's encouraging that the curator said that. I do think that, you know, the truth will out, the good work will come forward, and you just really have to keep working. One of the things I kind of meant to say in my introductory statement is, I think all of you who make artwork know this, but the core of the experience has to be enough to carry you through the work. You know, there's one thing, it's kind of interesting that Elaine de Kooning says later on in 9th Street Women is, she said, every time there's a movie about an artist, you know, the people get it wrong. They think that the artist is motivated by getting some sort of fame, and then the work comes along and that's good. It's the effort of making your work that pulls you forward into a long distance walk of your own journey. And there are little flutters of attention and then silence and things. And, you know, I just think it's important to realize that's part of the way artists help each other too, is to listen to that and give valuable response about work. Because we all, it's a lot more lonely situation than some kinds of creative work. Like friends of mine who are in orchestras, they're almost like aspen trees, you know, a stand of aspen trees are all really one community through the root system. Well, we need to connect a little bit like that more, I think.
So when we were meeting, all of you at different points kind of picked up on that idea that even at times where maybe, whether it was related to gender or not, things weren't happening in your career, staying true to your work and focusing on that and pushing that component through was what kind of kept you going. So one thing that came up too was an idea of mentorship and just kind of looking at what we can do as leaders in the art world here to be sure that generations coming after us, I mean, these disparities are broken down and changed. And how do you, I kind of like think I would like each of you, because I think you'll bring different things to that answer, if y'all could talk about that.
I mainly remember people who were supportive of me when I was in school, and Robert Prusser and Robert Joy, and the encouragement they gave to me, and that enriched my life so much. And teaching is a process of giving, and I feel like I've given for years. I've taught at the museum school, I've taught at the University of Houston, at St. Thomas, of course. Cooper Union. I was a tenured faculty at Cooper Union and the assistant dean, and started the summer program at Bennington with a friend of mine who's a writer, and also taught at Sarah Lawrence, which all of them wonderful experiences that were enriching to me in many ways. And I, in turn, have looked to do the same kind of, to give the same kind of support with the hundreds of students that I have, encouraging them, boosting them. You know, it's a very lonely and isolated life, and there's nobody to tell you that something's right. There's no answer ever. So you're really on your own. And I was looking at this work and how diverse it is and how different. And where did it come from, you know? Nobody has told you, well, that's good or that's bad. You might get a little gravy back once in a while, but you're mainly out there. So I think the best thing is for us to give encouragement to each other, to mentor each other, and to, just by talking like we've been talking, or collaborating, doing things like that. And that's how it's happened with me. This giving, and when you give, it comes back. And so it's been an ongoing thing of mentoring and also receiving.
Well, I really have loved hearing about both of your experiences teaching, and it is such a in one way I think of it as continuing an oral tradition. Like no one has had the teachers I've had filtering their energy through me. And so, you know, we all take what we can use and need from different teaching situations, learning situations, and they're not always necessarily art classes. I learned just as much from Hewitt Emmett, the plantsman. But I also think it's curious. I read once Philip Glass talking about one of his toughest teachers. It was a woman, a Vietnamese woman he was studying with there in Vietnam, I think, studying violin and music theory, and she was the toughest teacher he had. And he said, you know, that I value that so much, but if you think about it, I'm only, this is Glass talking, 8 generations away from Beethoven. So you think about, you know, that it's such a privilege that we're in the midst of this continuing dialogue and culture, a visual culture, and how much it's opening up now. I also, thinking about my own school days, you know, in the 70s, for instance, if you said art, you meant painting. Or you would say sculpture or photography. You didn't even mention craft. It was in a lower rung. So, you know, it's so fabulous, for instance, getting to know what Rabea is doing, bringing in all sorts of new ways of thinking. Anyway, teaching is the honor of bringing all of this through oneself to new people who will translate it different ways and bring it all forward. So guess that is the way I would answer that.
Thank you. I'm still learning as both of them are talking about why I definitely should ask for mentorship more, because it was so integral to my upbringing. My mom knew, I guess, I have never talked to her about it, but she knew to put very strong women in my life because she was working full time, so I had to. And I was about either junior high or early high school age when my mentor at the time drove me from DeRidder to Texas Southern University and took me to the Ebony Fashion Fair. That was a thing. Oh my gosh, it blew me away to walk across a college campus because I never saw myself there, because I never, just wasn't groomed for that. And not just because, you know. And that was one experience that stuck with me. That and another mentor I had, television, because of my generation, and just that's what we did. Shows like The Cosby Show in a Different World and Spike Lee's film School Days was the first time it clicked. You know, because my parents just didn't pressure me to go to college, but it clicked. Like, you know, you can go and do this, right? It's like I almost needed permission. But seeing myself, because of my mentor, taking me by the hand and walking me across campus and saying, you know, this is for you, right? This could be for you. And then fast forward to after college, I was working as a case manager, not being an artist, being miserable inside, and sitting across the most amazing Dr. Pamela McPherson, who was a psychiatrist, and she was like 8 months pregnant. And because I would have to report my clinical notes from my clients to her. And I just told her one day, I was like, man, I just admire you so much. You're a mom, you're a doctor, you're giving such great advice that was just so genuine and authentic to children that don't matter to most. And I was like, I'm just honored to be in your presence. And she said, you shouldn't be among us, be one of us. And I was like, what do you mean? She's like, get your master's, and you can also have, you know, it was just that comment that changed everything. It, like within 3 years, I was already in Houston after that. I just needed permission because I saw that you can't become what you don't see. You cannot become what you don't see. So what we do is very important because there's other people that are coming up that need to see us. You know, if you want to say as women artists or whatever label you want to throw on that. It's my responsibility, it's our responsibility to mentor others that are coming up. You have to.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. Don't be among us, be one of us. That's pretty cool. I think if we all took that
changed
as a
me.
like, yeah, that's pretty awesome. Well, thank you all. I mean, this has been really great, and I've enjoyed getting to know you. I think right now I'd like to kind of open it up to the audience. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to take the mic so everyone can hear.
Hi. I have a couple of concerns. One with you when you said there are no great female artists out there. What parameters are you using? Money?
So that was a quote from Linda Nochlin. She wrote an essay in 1971, and it's called "Why Are There No Great Female Artists?" And you can find it. It's a really fascinating read. Her parameters she set were basically looking at, in reality, there aren't, because there have not been women with the same privileges that men have had. But you'll have to read her. I mean, there's a lot. That's a really quick summary.
Sorry, I didn't hear that part.
Yeah, that's a real fast summary. So you got to read it. It's a really interesting, whether you agree with it or not, the kind of points she brings up throughout it are fascinating.
And I have one for the lady on the right. When you said that the people who tend to go to shows are quite color specific in terms of the show. Example, Hispanics go to Hispanic shows, black people go to black shows, white people go to white shows. I would disagree with you. I think if you are involved in the arts, I'll give you two examples. Project Row Houses, okay? I would bet that there's a third, and a third in terms of white, Hispanic, black people. Nathaniel Donnet, I mean, highly sought after. I think it's a little unfair to say that, or African Museum of Culture. I mean, I go along there. It's about again about a third and a third and a third, and I think it's a little bit unfair. I mean, do you not get that, or
No.
I'm just quite sure I'll sit down there.
Places like Project Row Houses are unique. They're located in historically black neighborhoods, which I live in. My studio is on campus at Project Row Houses. I go to all the events that I can, and you're absolutely right about Project Row Houses, absolutely. And I was speaking in very, very general terms, and we're talking about sort of the overall climate, and that was certainly just my experience. If you're the person going to shows and you see a mixture of races at that show, that's what you're that's awesome. You're that very small percentage that I see, or maybe things are changing, you know what I mean? Or, you know, like for me though, it's something that I've noticed the whole time I've been in Houston. It's still overall happens. Yes, there are a few artists Nathaniel showed, because, you know, he's a great artist and he works very, very, very hard at building relationships with other institutions that are primarily one or the other, you know, white institutions, black institutions. He works very hard on a level where he's, you know, built those relationships. But, you know, there's no map of Houston shows which are, you know, there's no segregated map of which shows are which. You go to the shows you go to because those are the people that you know and support. If you know it, and if you know artists of different backgrounds and different races and you go to those shows, then that's sort of a responsibility we could all sort of bear and investigate and support all of those. That's what I want to do. That's what sort of the norm should be. That should be the norm, what you're experiencing. But I don't think it's everybody's norm, unfortunately. But what you're describing should be the norm, that we shouldn't even have to have a conversation about, you know, one audience over the other.
So I want to agree with your comment just from observation. I mean, when I went to see Faith Ringgold, I was one of the very few white people in the audience then that was last year after Harvey at the Museum of African American History. I think it among artists that might not be as true, but in the general public, I think it is. Mm-hmm. That when you get away from just the artists who know each other and know and maybe some of us do go to other people's shows because we know them, but in the general public, if you go to ensemble theater, it's probably true, okay? I don't know, I haven't been there either lately.
It's true the last time I went.
Yeah, I think it's true. I think there is an isolation by culture, by race, by ethnicity. It's unfortunate.
I want to jump in here. I think if you want to look at it through the lens of filmmaking, I mean, there's very much sort of target audience for this group, whether it's young or, you know, middle-aged white people, black, but yeah, then there's always some breakout star who will bring from every group, you know. So I think it would be lovely if it were a little bit more evenly shared, these experiences, and I think that is one thing we can talk about. I also think that might be part of the resistance we all three had about, you know, women artists as a category. And I think, you know, the world is changing, like Rabea says, and it's also becoming much less binary in terms of gender. Let's talk about that. I mean, female women artists, or are we, you know, going to be a little bit more inclusive and, you know, LGBTIQ, you know, and I think maybe this idea about women's roles in art might be a little dated too, in a sense. What do you think?
Well, I've always been in a situation where there's been a woman artist, I'm teaching situation because that's sort of my life, where there's been a well-respected woman in the context of the situation. Even here, when my first job at the museum, Dorothy Hood was there. She was respected. She was a serious artist. And when I moved to New York, there were many, many women. And what Milton Resnick was saying, Pat, his wife, there was this sense of, it was very hard to identify. I found more interaction between genders, less emphasis on whether you were a male or female. It was more about who was working and how interesting their work was and this sort of thing. And so moving to New York was just this big melting pot of one of my best and closest colleagues at Cooper was Jack Whitten, and he has a show here now. Most inventive work. And he was, there was no divide there.
Yeah, that's an interesting, I'm glad y'all are talking about this because, so all of Art League went to this conference called the Common Field convening this past week, and it was in Philly. And one of the things they ask you about is like your preferred gender pronouns and things like that. And there was actually a discussion in the conference about are we just aiding to the problem and even identifying the gender pronouns?
Yes.
And if those barriers, and part of going back to what Rabea was talking about, which wanting this more fluid community of support throughout all areas of breaking that down and just looking at it as what it is, an artist and representing on all fronts.
Can I ask you a personal question? It might apply to this, but why do you sign your name and put her, she under it?
Yeah, so
That sounds like it's going just in the other direction.
So one thing we were trying to do with Art League, and we actually, since coming back from this conference, have been talking about this amongst ourselves, our staff at Art League, but just making sure being inclusive of all identities and making sure that if people wanted to let us know their preferred identity, how you identify as a person, white, female, European, just your preferred she, her, just right out front. I went to one session where that was the first thing they asked everyone to do. And that way, you just knew. But then there is the question about that. And Jenny and I have been talking about that quite a bit, that if that is just adding to that kind of the binary, just the split instead of just and helping. But there's a lot of, so Rabea, one thing you brought up that I think is interesting is with the Latinx shows going on right now. Art League has a show up right now, Hira Hora, queer Latinx artists under 30. And there are some outstanding artists in that show. Some of them have said, and I 100% agree, that they have tried to get solo exhibitions even at Art League. And we have an artist advisory board, so that's reviewing, but haven't been able to get in. So in order to get a show, they had to have a curator come forward to pitch a show, and then they got in. And I'm very grateful because there's some artists in there, and with staff we've talked about, those are some amazing artists, and I didn't know about them before this Latinx movement has gone through town. And I think that's part of it, is just kind of being very aware, going to the small spaces, the big spaces, checking out what's going on, and kind of staying tapped in that way. Any other questions?
The first time I saw Rabea's art was at Joan Wick. Is that how you say her name? You might have been her last show, in fact, or one of her last.
Close.
And then the next time when I bought some of your art, it was at Linda Dark's, and of course, Pat said Betty Moody. So I wanted to ask, are women-owned galleries more receptive to women artists, or am I just imagining things based on my own personal experience?
No, I don't think you can say that. I don't think you can say that. There are many women, but I don't think they're more receptive at all. I think that's too generalized. Maybe some are, maybe some aren't.
Pat, will you lean forward a little?
I don't think that's the way, Betty.
Well, I do remember when I first opened in '75. I was laughing about this. There was a group called the Gorilla Girls in town. And one picture that has been circulating lately that I cannot abide is one of me when I started the gallery, and they're all male artists. So that's how it started. It was all male artists. And it was quickly pointed out to me in the newspaper that I was boy crazy by the Gorilla Girls. And, you know, I hadn't, it's like, well, here's I'm a female starting a gallery and doing this. And now I have by far over the years, as Pat knows,
Yes.
have a lot of female women artists and have for a long, long time. And why it took the Gorilla Girls to point something out to me, it was so just obvious, my goodness. What was that about? Do you know? Anyway, it was the time, I guess, but it's
Right.
changed.
Any other? Oh. I think we have time for a couple more.
Okay, so just a comment. So I've seen a lot of this change. I'm on the national board for the Women's Caucus for Art, and I go to the meetings, and I've seen a lot of change. I think some of it has, in the past and even now, has to do with financial and what women could do and what they couldn't do and where they were. Because, okay, so the organizations, even the local organizations, if you look who belongs to organizations, it's usually people who can and who can afford to. And attracting those younger people, it's been a big issue for us. At WCA, we're trying to get the younger artists involved but some of it is just who has the time and money to do this.
Well, you're talking about the galleries and the organization
Just
behind the
any
artists.
organizations,
Yes.
VAA, any organization.
Well, that's true, yeah.
It's like who of us, and if you look, it is heavily white
Yes.
and a certain age range in almost any, and not just in the art world. This is in the symphony, in all over the arts. It's just, so I don't know where you come from that and how you can get out of that, but.
Well, it's
But-
like I was saying earlier, the art world is just a subset of the general society, and it's across the board in many, many professions. It's hard to talk about it and not sound duplicitous about privilege and who can do what. You're right, it's a good point.
Okay. Oh, okay, one more.
Thanks. Well, this brings up something I've been thinking about a lot lately, which is it's a cultural norm that we all grew up with to walk into a crowd and say, oh, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, African, whatever. And it's the same with gender, looking at different people and commenting mentally without saying it. How do you see them? And I just think this is something that I hope will develop into not categorizing people based on our cultural identities. So that's,
I think we just are born with, our internal biases develop, and we all have them. I do the same thing when I walk in the room. Oh, this is a song. But what do you do past that? That's not something my brain can control. I'm assessing my audience. Sometimes that changes the way I navigate through the space, to be honest. You know what I mean? So I think it's just getting, differences exist. That's fine.
children coming along. We play together all the time with children of all colors and races.
That's a new
And I
concept,
think
though.
that they may come to a different way of looking at the world than we do with our cultural bias.
Right, and different generations look at their cultural biases differently, and I think I've heard, I'm not 100% sold on statistics because I don't often trust where those sources come from, and you can sway numbers in any direction you really want them to. It's really more about like just personal experience. So I kind of shy away from saying too many things that represent too big of a group, you know what I mean? But I think because we teach cultural biases in children, they're just like little sponges, This, the way they make art is better than I make art because I overthink everything and they don't. I make, when children make friends. They're not overthinking. I wonder what religion that other kid is from. But I'll tell you what, there was a video my colleague sent me. It was called Being 12. And at the age of 12, these kids are noticing things they shouldn't have to be noticing, making fun of other kids for whatever reason. Kids make fun, of each other, sometimes in a playful way, but the things that they were bringing up in this particular video were things that is like our responsibility as adults to take care of. But that's a big job, and I'm not a parent, so it's difficult for me to to speak too much on that. But as an educator, I have control of my setting and what I project and the images that I project to these young minds that are coming up. And then I also have to be careful at what images I look at and how that changes me. And that responsibility I bear on, the generation above me and the generation, above them, and how everything sort of trickles down and repeats.
Okay. Well, thank you all. This has been fascinating and thank you to Lisa and the VA once again for having us.
Thank you, Lisa.